Since October 7th, when Hamas launched their attack on Israel, the United States has stood in solidarity behind Israel and the Jewish community. However, on home soil, Joe Biden has been facing criticism from within his own party over his unwavering support of Israel. The Biden administration took the stance it was 100% in support of Israel, no questions asked.
And let there be no doubt, the United States has Israel's back. We will make sure the Jewish and democratic state of Israel can defend itself today, tomorrow, as we always have. It's as simple as that. These atrocities have been sickening. We're with Israel. Let's make no mistake. Thank you.
Mr. President, what was your reaction?
But the conflict between Hamas and Israel has divided people around the world who believe it's not as simple as just throwing support behind just Israel.
Well, I think President Biden is a very, what you would call, old school Democrat when it comes to foreign policy. And many of those Democrats have always believed in the strength of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And so I think, when he was considering what to do, he did something really profound, which is he had the moral courage to call out the terrorist attack and not to get distracted by sort of the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think that was sort of the most important choice that he made. And I think ultimately, his calculus right now is fundamentally driven by his longtime support for Israel. I don't know that this is particularly motivated by electoral politics in the way a lot of foreign policy sometimes can be. I think this is something that, he has stood up for Israel for his entire career. And I think this is an example of that. Where I do see politics entering in, however, is in his inability to directly criticize Iran to the extent that many on the right believe that Iran should be held responsible for these attacks.
While we've seen pro-Palestine protests taking place around the world and examples of anti-Semitism towards the Jewish community, there also seems to be a divide within the Democratic Party. Progressives within the party have called out their own leader, Joe Biden, for not backing Palestine. As the first Palestinian American woman elected to Congress, Rashida Tlaib has been a vocal critic of the way President Biden has handled the conflict.
President Biden, not all of America's with you on this one. And you need to wake up and understand that. We are literally watching people commit genocide and killing a vast majority just like this, and we still stand by and say nothing.
Congresswoman Tlaib continued her criticism of President Biden online when she took to Twitter to question whether he was going to remain silent over the thousands of Palestinians sheltering in a hospital. She tweeted, "Where are they supposed to go? Where? You must demand that your BFF Netanyahu withdraws his evacuation order. Our country can't keep supporting this massacre of civilians." Another Democratic Congresswoman, Cori Bush, has also been publicly going against her administration's agenda by pushing the president to call for a ceasefire.
And to all of my colleagues and to all of the advocates, thank you for your courage and your bravery, because we are all grieving at the profound loss of life that has occurred over the past 10 days. At least 2,700 Palestinians, 1,400 Israelis, and many Americans have been killed. Tens of thousands of people have been injured. Nearly 200 Israelis are being held hostage. Families have been destroyed, and Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Muslims are facing unimaginable trauma as they navigate this horrific moment.
The idea of a ceasefire has become a contested subject within the Democratic Party. President Biden has claimed he will not ask Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to call for a ceasefire until Hamas releases over 200 hostages. But this decision is clearly not in the interest of every member of his party, because at least 18 Democrats have signed a letter calling on the White House to push for a ceasefire.
I think what Israel has suggested and what President Biden has suggested is that, we need to make sure that we get these over 200 hostages out. Many of them are children, many of them are elderly, many of them have health problems, and many of them were physically wounded during the terrorist attack. So I think the idea is we want to get aid into Gaza, but we need to make sure, number one, that it's not going to get siphoned off to support Hamas fighters as opposed to the civilian population.
Through these public displays of division, it has become clear that the Democratic Party are not all united on its decision to support Israel.
I think there's a ton of fighting happening for the soul of the Democratic Party, in the same way that we've seen fighting happening for the soul of the Republican Party right now. Both parties are in shifts. Right now, of course, the big challenge is between what I would consider the sort of traditional Democrats and then the very progressive wing of the party, people that are represented by Cori Bush, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar. And you're seeing that play out very publicly. I can only imagine how much more conversation and vitriol there is in private. The Democrats have been a lot better at keeping that private than the Republicans have been. You know, Republicans tend to air it publicly, as we've seen with the speaker fight. Democrats are a lot more sophisticated in keeping it private. And so what you're seeing in public, I would imagine, is only, 10% of the internal fighting that we're seeing. It's not just around Israel, it's around our universities, it's around anti-Semitism, it's around foreign military financing, it's around humanitarian assistance. So I think there are a lot more components to this and the internal Democratic fighting than what we're seeing play out in public.
Not only do those 18 Democrats want a ceasefire, members of Hollywood do too. Hundreds of celebrities have signed an open letter to the president calling for him to not only make sure all hostages are released, but also orchestrate a ceasefire. We urge your administration, Congress and all world leaders to honour all of the lives in the Holy Land and call for and facilitate a ceasefire without delay, an end to the bombing of Gaza and the safe release of hostages. Even with the Biden administration backing Israel completely, that didn't stop further tension within the party. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre copped criticism for her answer on anti-Semitism in America.
Level of concern right now about the potential rise of anti-Semitism in light of everything that's going on in Israel?
So a couple of things. We have not seen any credible threats. I know there's been always questions about credible threats, and so just want to make sure that that's out there. But look, Muslim and those perceived to be Muslim have endured a disproportionate number of hate-fueled attacks. And certainly President Biden understands that many of our Muslim, Arab Americans and Palestinian American loved ones and neighbors are worried about the hate being directed at their communities, and that is something you heard the president speak to in his address just last Thursday. And so one of the things that the president has done is directed his team, Homeland Security team, to prioritize prevention and disruption of any emerging threats that could harm the Jewish, the Muslim, Arab Americans, or any other communities. And that is something that the president has sought to do and since day one. As you know, the president ran on bringing protecting communities, obviously, but bringing people together, protecting the soul of the nation, and so that is something that the president takes very, very seriously.
The man criticising Joe Biden's press secretary actually came from within the Democratic Party. Florida Congressman Jared Moskowitz hit out at Karine Jean-Pierre's answer. He tweeted, "What a weak answer, and why are you looking in the book? What's the approved answer? The simple answer is yes, you are concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism. Of course, we are worried about hatred against Muslim Americans. We must do better." Things intensified for the Democrats when Senator Ed Markey was booed while speaking at a pro-Israel rally in Boston.
There must be a de-escalation of the current violence. The United States should...
Massachusetts is considered one of the most left-leaning states in the country. So to have a member of Joe Biden's Congress booed at a rally continues to show the conflict between Israel and Hamas has caused division within the United States. The way Joe Biden responds to war and his presence on the world stage is an important sign ahead of next year's presidential election.
Yeah, well, I think there's sort of two different angles to this. There's what the president has said since the attacks, and then what the president has either done since the attack or even before the attack. So what he said, I think, has been very morally courageous, very profound, speaking about right versus wrong, which I think is exactly the situation that we're in, making sure that people understand that the civilians of Gaza are not getting lost in all of this, but also recognizing that there's no moral equivalence between, a terrorist attack against civilians and then a military response against terrorists. Where I think there's been a significant problem, and where I see a lot in the Arab world and the Western world being critical of President Biden, is that his weakness on the world stage, frankly, and I take no joy in saying this, invited in a lot of this aggression, not only from Iran and not only from Hamas, but also from Russia, which has invaded Ukraine, from China, which is threatening to invade Taiwan. All of these things are connected in that the symbol of the United States is no longer one of strength and power, it's one of weakness and retreat. I think both parties have been the reason for that, but particularly President Biden in reducing sanctions on the Iranian regime just prior to this attack. I think it just symbolized that we weren't willing to take the threats against American interests seriously enough, and unfortunately, we're now paying the consequences of that.
When President Biden travelled to Israel this month to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu, he was mocked for his public blunders and gaffes.
Years ago, I asked the Secretary of State when he and I were working in the Senate to write something for him, and he said, he wrote a line that I think is appropriate. He said, it's not, we lead, not just, well, I won't go into it, I'll wait later. Taking too much time.
With the United States experiencing its highest level of federal debt in history, the amount of foreign aid, military and assistance sent to war-torn countries will play on the minds of voters next November.
Well, I think a lot of Americans are really scared about what this means. We've had over 20 American service members that have been injured by attacks from Iranian proxies since the October 7th terrorist attack. So we're starting to see America slowly get sort of forced into this, even if we don't want to be. And I think that's very worrisome for Americans. We want to figure out a way that, we can avoid war if at all possible. And the question is if it's even possible at this point. So I think a lot of Americans are going to be looking for a president who is going to be able to show strength, who can understand the difference between showing strength and, escalating a situation. And so I do think it's going to play a significant role. I think they're going to be looking at foreign policy a lot more than we would have looked at it, let's say, last year or even 6 months ago.